Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit. Bandwidth for Triangulation is brought to you by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com. This is Triangulation, Episode 9, recorded March 30th, 2011. Ray Kurzweil. So Ray Kurzweil is a legend, really, in the artificial intelligence business. He's done so much, including, he's the transhumanist movement. He's a scientist. He's a thinker. And he says he wants to live long enough to live forever. And I think we've got him on the line here. Hi, Ray.
Oh, we have him on the line, but we don't have him turned up.
I don't hear audio. If you can get, I think it's your end. There
great
you,
to
there
be
you
with
go.
you.
Hey, hi, Ray. It's great to see
Okay.
you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
You got
with you virtually.
You got a nice studio there. Can you hear me?
You've got an interesting studio there also.
Interesting is the word. Are you at MIT? Where are you?
I'm at my office. There's actually a projection system. I can project three-dimensionally to venues. So I give about 20 speeches a year using this 3D virtual projection system. So
Wow.
as I move around, the audience sees their local background behind me. So, and I look 3D, and I'm life-size. I can establish eye contact. So this, what we're doing now is just conventional video conferencing, which is pretty cool. But
Old-fashioned. You're
very kind. It's pretty cool. It ain't 3D, that's for sure.
Skype is very cool.
Is that 3D thing similar to what people would have seen on CNN when they had Will.i.am on the election a few years back, or is it a different system?
It's a different system that allowed you. That was full body. This system, you see pretty much what you're seeing now. Looks like I'm standing at a podium.
Okay.
And at the venue, they see a podium, and it looks like I'm standing behind it. It's called Laporte. I'm actually the only speaker in the world who has his own system.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not something you invented?
No.
We have to get one of those.
Yeah, we're gonna have to put one in the new studio.
I'd like to have a Teleportec in our studio.
You wouldn't have to leave the house.
So, one of the challenges talking to you, Ray, is to characterize, to give you a title.
Well, I call myself inventor, author, futurist.
That's good. Inventor, author, futurist.
And that's kind of the order in which things happened. I decided I'd be an inventor when I was 5.
Uh-huh.
And so I sort of retired. People, my age start talking about retirement. And my first thought is I'm never going to retire. But my second thought is I actually did retire when I was 5 years old. Because I've been doing what I love to do. But I quickly realized that to be successful, timing was critical. I mean, Larry Page and Sergey Brin had a great idea about reverse engineering the links on the internet to create a better search engine, but they did it at exactly the right time. And so realizing this about 30 years ago, I began to collect a lot of data. Being an engineer, I thought I would try to come up with something data-driven. And I started with the common wisdom that you can't predict the future. And discovered that if you measure the underlying properties of information technology, the classical example is MIPS per dollar, but there's 100 other measurements like this, and not just in computers, also in biological technologies like genetic sequencing, the amount of data, the cost per base pair, brain data, spatial resolution of brain scanning. I could mention a lot of different things, nodes on the internet, bits we move around on the internet, bits we move around wirelessly. They follow remarkably predictable trajectories, and those predictable trajectories are exponential, not linear, and our intuition is not exponential but linear. So people's expectations of the future are that things are going to continue at the current pace. So, for example, I predicted that the Genome Project would be finished on time in 15 years. 7.5 years into this 15-year project, 1% of it had been done. So critics said, well, we told you this wasn't going to work. Here you did 1% in 7 years. It's going to take 700 years. And that's a very good linear analysis, but in fact was done 7 years later because it was doubling every year, and 1% is only 7 doublings from 100%. And there's many phenomena like that. I mean, in the class, I saw computing had grown in this exponential manner completely smoothly and predictably since the 1890 census, and was not affected by little things that happened in the 20th century, like World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the Great Depression. It's continued for those 30 years. So I'm not just noticing this now and overfitting the past data. I've been making these forward-looking predictions for 30 years.
This is from the chart from the Singularity is near the evolution of computer power and cost. Very linear.
Well, that's linear on a
logarithmic
scale,
right?
Which is exponential.
So it's actually a hockey stick, really.
And it's actually a curve on an exponential, because actually the rate of exponential growth has been growing exponentially. But this is $1 billion more powerful per dollar than the computer I used as a student, and we'll do it again in 25 years. And we're shrinking the technology. It's 100,000 times smaller than that computer that I used as a student. 25 years, this will be the size of a blood cell and more powerful. So
I think a lot of people get hung up when they start thinking about these things, saying, but how can we continue to do this? How can you prove that this is going to continue on a logarithmic scale? They want to know the underlying reasons. And a lot of what I've read ignores that and says, we're looking at the trends, we're not looking at the whys. Is it safe to do that, to say, to make that analysis?
Well, that's really what the whole book, The Singularity is Near, is about, is to make that case. And every time one paradigm has run out of steam, we've gone to another paradigm. It creates research pressure to create the next paradigm. Moore's law, the shrinking of component sizes on an integrated circuit, was not the first paradigm to bring exponential growth to computing. It's the fifth. There were shrinking vacuum tubes in the 1950s.
Interesting.
In 1952, CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower with a vacuum tube-based computer, and then every year they were making the vacuum tubes smaller and smaller. I have a museum. We have a computer with little vacuum tubes. That finally hit a wall. We got to a point where they couldn't do that anymore and keep the vacuum, and that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. It was not the end of the exponential growth of computing. It then went to the fourth paradigm, transistors, and then to the fifth paradigm, which is Moore's law and chips. And there's been regular predictions, that's going to come to an end.
Right, we'll hit a molecular limit or something like that.
Well, we're going to get to a limit until, Gordon Moore originally said 2002, until now says 2022. By that time, the key features will be 4 nanometers, which is about 20 carbon atoms, and we won't be able to shrink them anymore. But, we do live in a three-dimensional world. Chips are flat. They have multiple layers of material, but it's only one layer of circuitry. We've taken a baby step in the third dimension with multi-layer chips. But three-dimensional molecular computing will allow us to actually compute in 3 dimensions, which is what our brain does, even though it uses a very slow type of circuitry. And if you do the analysis, based on what we've actually demonstrated at a small scale, molecular computing will enable these trends to go well into the late 21st century. But by that time, computers will be trillions, if not trillions of times more powerful than the human brain. So,
what do you think of Jeff Hawkins' Numenta and his attempt to kind of create a new kind of chip that simulates how the massively parallel brain?
Well, I think Hawkins has a very good insight as to the uniformity of the neocortex. The neocortex is this little region of the brain that does something called thinking, which you're probably familiar with, and
some of us
are. Yeah.
It's and remarkably, all the thinking we do uses a common paradigm. There's a little pattern recognizer that recognizes patterns, and that pattern might be a certain sequence of sounds, might be a certain sequence of shapes. So there's a bunch of recognizers that recognize a capital A. Well, it's actually the crossbar in the capital A, and those recognizers fire when they see, crossbar, and they're happy and fire and send that signal up to another set of recognizers. And when that recognizer gets a bunch of signals, it says, capital A, and it sends that up, and then it gets a bunch of signals from other recognizers and says, the word apple, and so on. At the very highest level of this conceptual hierarchy in the neocortex, there's recognizers that recognize things like humor and irony. And you might think that those are much more complicated, but actually they're the same. They just sit at the top end of this hierarchy. There was an incident or experiment where they were doing open brain surgery with this girl, which you can do because there's no pain receptors in the brain. And whenever they triggered a particular spot, this girl would start to laugh, and they assumed, well, they must be triggering some automatic laugh reflex. But actually, they discovered, no, they're actually triggering a point in her neocortex where she perceives humor. And she found everything hilarious whenever they triggered this spot. Like, you guys are so funny standing there would be a typical comment. So Hawking's had this thesis, which he's developed further over the years, building on this recognition that there's tremendous uniformity throughout the entire neocortex. It's a flat structure that sits outside the brain. It's folded up to increase the surface area, and it has about 1 billion of these recognizers. And we actually have a pretty good idea of how they work. Conceptually, Watson, the recent Jeopardy-playing computer, uses some biologically inspired paradigms that are really inspired by what we know about the type of recognition of patterns that are done in the neocortex. And interestingly, the neocortex can recognize complex three-dimensional forms, and you probably think that those are somehow three-dimensional recognizers, but actually they're all linear sequences of events. And so they're basically Lisp statements. So if you remember back in the 80s, people saying Lisp really represents the way the human brain thinks, and everybody thought that was hype, and of course these companies actually didn't do that well, but it actually turns out to be true, that each of these billion little pattern recognizers basically learns one Lisp statement, one list of events or other patterns. So this structure enables us to do what is unique among humans. I mean, other mammals have one, but they're not big enough to really do it at human levels. We can take a whole bunch of ideas and call that an idea and give it a symbol, and then use that symbol with other symbols representing other ideas and create another idea and give that a symbol, and then use that in another set of ideas. And this whole hierarchy we call knowledge. And was one of the enabling factors that allowed us to create tools. The other one is this humble appendage here so that I can really grasp things. And so my neocortex says, wow, I could take that branch and I could kind of strip it down and make a point, and then I could reach a higher branch with it and I could create this tool. Well, I then had actually an appendage that allowed me to carry that out, and I created tools. And then we used our tools to create the next tools. And that's actually why the power, particularly is measured in terms of their information content. At least that gives us a way of measuring them, sort of like MIPS per dollar or bits of communication in the world. We always use the latest tools to create the next ones, and that's why they grow exponentially in power. So I have a whole theoretical analysis in the book. I have a mathematical derivation. But really the core of the case is the empirical case. And I give example after example of all kinds of different trends in communications, in brain reverse engineering, in biology, and many other areas, showing that if you can measure the underlying information properties of a technology, it follows these remarkably smooth exponential trajectories. And it does go through from paradigm to paradigm. So people say, well, there must be some ultimate limit.
Is there a sixth paradigm? Yeah, what's next?
Well, the sixth paradigm is three-dimensional molecular computing. And so what's the limit of that? And I actually worked that out in the book. And there is a limit, but it's not very limiting. You can then get into speculation of things like beyond nanocomputing, femtocomputing, computing with components of atoms. I don't actually go there. And actually, Eric Drexler, who's the founder of nanotechnology, is skeptical about femtocomputing. You don't have to go there. Just with nanocomputing, all the scenarios in my book become feasible. We'll be able to create a 2-pound, computer the size of a laptop that is trillions of times more powerful than the human brain, just with the sixth paradigm.
And there's an overriding principle at work, too, that we don't have to know what those advances are any more than the folks who worked on the first vacuum tubes understood three-dimensional molecular computing. It will be discovered. It sort of seems like it's an inertia in a way.
It's remarkable how predictable this is because what we're measuring is creativity, innovation, competition, free enterprise. You would think that would be very unpredictable. Indeed, it is unpredictable at a project-by-project level. So it was clear that search engines were coming, 15 years ago. It wasn't clear which one of the 20 or 30 projects that were actually known, and there were many more sort of laboring in garages that were unknown, would prevail. It's unpredictable which scientist, which project, which idea, which platform will prevail in the marketplace. But the overall results follow these remarkably predictable trajectories, and people say, well, they must be disrupted by war, depressions, the Great Recessions. But no, they weren't disrupted in the recent recession or the Great Depression or the two world wars or the Cold War or any of that. It's a remarkably smooth, inexorable progression. So then people say, well, gee, if it's going to happen anyway, why don't we just all sit back and relax and let it happen? And then, of course, then it wouldn't happen.
Right.
But I think we can count on
humans
people
don't
being
work that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. People are motivated to create new breakthroughs and new knowledge. It's a little bit like thermodynamics. I mean, thermodynamics, if you look at the mathematics, models each particle is following a random walk. I can't tell where this molecule will be 10 seconds from now. Nonetheless, the overall properties of the gas are highly predictable to a high level of precision according to the laws. They are considered laws, even though they are an emergent property of random behavior. And it's the same thing here. Each project's unpredictable. The overall result, if you can measure it, and with information technology, there are many such measures available. It follows an exponential trajectory. And it's important to point out that it's not intuitive. The reason that we can anticipate the future, the reason we are intelligent, is that it has a survival benefit. I'm walking through the savannah, and I see this animal coming at me, and I can make a linear prediction where it's going to be and where I shouldn't be. And that worked fine, and it got hardwired in our brains. And so our intuition, even among sophisticated scientists, is linear. And even if someone's an expert in their field, they haven't really studied this issue of technological progression. So invariably, when I get into debate, it's the underlying issue, even if my critic doesn't realize it, is this difference in perspective of linear versus exponential. People say, oh, Kurzweil doesn't understand the complexity of the human brain. That's not true. I've studied this for 50 years. I have a very good appreciation of what the level of complexity is. It's that they don't appreciate the tremendous power of exponential growth. 30 steps linearly gets you to 30, 30 steps exponentially gets you to a billion. That's why this is a billion times more powerful, literally, per dollar in terms of MIPS, in terms of bits, memory, in terms of bits of communication, compared to when I was a student. And I will do it again in 25 years.
So even though our brain isn't very good at perceiving this, I think you make a really strong case in this book, The Singularity is Near, that we are about to approach, there's the paperback. I have the hardcover. They're about to approach the singularity. Wait, can you define the singularity for us? What are you talking about when you say the singularity is near?
Well, singularity as it's used, and it was first used in this sense by Werner Vinge, although it was used in passing, just in a sentence by John von Neumann originally, where he noticed this phenomena, that things are getting faster and faster and growing exponentially, and he said, this is going to reach a singularity. He just said that in passing. Werner Vinge developed the term more in the way we're using it, and then I've developed my thesis of the law of accelerating returns and examined what this will mean. And we're really borrowing a metaphor from physics, which in turn actually borrowed this metaphor from mathematics. In mathematics, it's where the model breaks down. If you divide, let's say, a constant, 1, by x, as x approaches 0, that function approaches infinity. But actually, strictly speaking, in the axioms of real numbers, there's no infinity. So we actually say when 1 over x and x becomes 0, it's undefined. The model just breaks down. Same thing happens in physics. In physics, in theory, at the center of a black hole, there's an infinite level of mass and energy, but actually quantum mechanics doesn't allow a literally infinite level. So it just becomes vast and unmeasurable. And beyond an event horizon, around the singularity in physics, you really can't see very well because any information that goes in it becomes trapped inside the black hole. And then, of course, recently Hawking admitted actually you can, with difficulty, see inside a black hole because events outside the black hole are quantum encrypted with events inside the black hole. And so in theory, there's a way to see inside it, but not very easily. So we're borrowing this metaphor now for this future historical event where things become so different, so transformed, that it's hard to see beyond the event horizon. The singularity is this event horizon. And according to my calculations, by 2029, we will achieve parity in terms of machine intelligence and human intelligence.
It's 18 years.
That actually will, at that point, computers will be able to combine that subtlety and suppleness of human pattern recognition with ways in which computers are already superior. They can read billions of documents. I mean, consider Watson in the recent Jeopardy. It had a higher score than the two best human players combined. Yet, and people have pointed this out, and I agree, its ability to understand human language was not quite up to those humans because it made some pretty stupid mistakes. But it actually does have, a fairly good ability to understand human language, which is something that people thought would never happen. It could understand that something was a metaphor, that something was a joke, that something was a pun. And
do you think, you mentioned in your blog post that it maybe had a sense of humor? You think that that's fair?
Well, it was not programmed to have a sense of humor. That actually might have helped it with its bedside manner. It wasn't very gracious when it
an
when
inadvertent
won,
sense of humor, I guess.
It did. It did have an inadvertent sense of humor in one case. But the point I was going to make that even though its level of understanding was somewhat below the humans, it was able to win anyway, because whatever level it had, it was able to read and understand at that level all of Wikipedia, other encyclopedias, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. By the way, its natural language ability was not just applied to the query, but to these hundreds of thousands of pages of stuff. Now, you and I could read Wikipedia. I think that's actually feasible. We wouldn't remember it. We don't have that kind of capacity, and in a few seconds be able to then mentally access all of this information. Watson could do that. In the future, they will be at human levels and combine it then with the tremendous capacity, at that point reading billions of pages, ultimately everything out on the internet, and then we'll continue to get smarter. There's the whole point where they can then access their own source code and make themselves smarter. The hardware is going to continue to grow in capacity. And by the way, it's not, in my view, an alien invasion of intelligent machines to displace us and compete with us. We're going to merge with these technologies. We already have.
It's not the Terminator. You're not worried about the Terminator.
I've merged with this, and I'd like to put it in my body.
That's your cell phone?
Then I would not lose it or forget it at home. It belongs in my body. That's where I will put it when it's small enough.
True.
So we are already a human machine civilization. It's not out in one government lab somewhere. It's not an invasion from Mars. But anyway, if you follow these exponential trajectories, the non-biological portion, the machine portion of our intelligence will be 1 billion times greater than all of biological intelligence today among humans. That's by 2045, and that's such a profound transformation that qualifies to be a very singular change in human history. And so we use this metaphor, the singularity.
And by which you mean we cannot predict what will happen on the other side. So.
However, I think actually we have enough intelligence to make some statements about what life will be like.
Well, tell us, too.
And understand it by analogy. Well, in many ways, we'll be doing the same thing we do now. Lots of people, like yourselves, are actually creating knowledge, which is to say radio programs or music or graphic arts or science or engineering or blog posts, and creating some kind of knowledge which itself doubles every 13 months by some measures. that was not true 100 years ago. Most people worked at physical labor. In fact, a third of the workforce worked on farms, and a third of the workforce worked in factories. In fact, if I were a prescient futurist in 1900, I would say, okay, well, 2/3 of your work on farms and factories, that'll be 3% and 3% in 100 years, in the year 2000. And everybody would go, my God, we're all going to be out of work.
And starve.
I'd say,
Yeah, right.
I'd say, don't worry, you'll be doing Skype radio broadcasts or designing websites. And
You'll find something to do.
no one would know what I was talking about.
Right.
In fact, most of the employment today, these job categories didn't exist 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. And that's going to continue to be the case. We're more and more, we're going to continue to move up Maslow's hierarchy. More and more people on the world will have their basic needs met. There's a certain portion of the population which does already. The world is, there's something I run into as I go around the world and share these ideas is, a lot of people think things are getting worse. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. The reason for that is we're actually doing a better job of knowing what's wrong with the world.
Yep.
There's you guys in the blogosphere and radio land and are letting the world know, and we can see right on our palm tops a battle in Fallujah or Tripoli or other problems. That may be disturbing, but it's a good thing, because if we see problems, we are motivated to fix them. The reality is I have graphs which I've developed now for my presentations on things like education and wealth of nations and health and longevity. They're all very smoothly going up. We've doubled the number of years of schooling in both the developed and developing world over the last 50 years. Human longevity has gone from 37 in 1800 to pushing 80 today, and that's going to go into high gear now that health and medicine is in information technology.
Do we have any idea of how our culture will be able to adapt to the increasing acceleration? We see this right now where folks who are from a generation above take a little longer, in most cases, not all cases, but they, in general, take a little longer to adapt and say, well, I don't understand Twitter. Why would I ever want to use Twitter? And it just takes a little longer to penetrate, or smartphones or computers even in some cases. And as the advances get faster, the gaps between the folks who are used to one thing and another start to shorten. Is there any information about that kind of adaptation, that kind of cultural acceptance?
Well, there's always early and late adopters, and we have a million choices. In fact, we have almost a million choices just for iPhone apps.
You're right. Yes.
So people sometimes ask, well, maybe I'm going to opt out of being enhanced by this technology, and maybe I don't want it, as if it were one thing.
Go for it.
There's going to be a million different choices. There will be nanobots that are so thoroughly tested and augment your immune system and protect you from a long list of diseases and aging processes. And you would be irresponsible not to do it and not to give your kids it, just the way, say, certain childhood vaccines are considered.
Vaccines are a good example of people sort of rebelling against this idea culturally, even though it is the responsible thing to do.
Right, but very few people don't use technology. Hugo de Garis has this idea of a war between, not war as he puts it, between the cosmists, people who enhance themselves with these technologies, with these very powerful machines in the future, and those who eschew that, she calls Terrans. I pointed out that would be a very short war. kind of like a war between our military-industrial complex and the Amish.
Right.
The fact
the Amish are scrappy, but yeah, I think I get your point.
And they do use some technologies too, but very few people are going to opt out completely. Very few people opt out completely today. Even if they don't tweet, they're affected by all of these technologies. They probably have a cell phone.
They've got a toilet. They've probably got indoor plumbing.
Well, it sounds like you say people will adapt faster. The folks who say, "Oh, I don't want to deal with this newfangled technology," will just sort of become a minority.
Yeah, look at the effect it has. If you live in Libya, you're affected because Revolution was spawned by social networks.
Even if you
Facebook,
don't know what Twitter is, you're affected by it. Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. It's affecting human communication. I wrote in my first book, The Age of Intelligent Machines, that the Soviet Union would be swept away by the then emerging decentralized communication, which mostly was email over these teletype machines over phone lines, and also fax machines. And people thought that was nuts. The Soviet Union, which was then going strong and was a mighty superpower, that's going to be swept away by a few teletype machines. But that's what happened. Then in that 1991 coup against Gorbachev, the photo op and the cover of Time magazine was a picture of Yeltsin standing on a tank.
Yeah.
But that was the old way of thinking. The tank had nothing to do with
Right.
it. It was the hackers with their clandestine network of basically a social network at that time that kept everybody in the know. And the paradigm of grabbing the central TV and radio station and the authorities keeping everybody in the dark didn't work anymore.
Yeah, we saw that in Egypt.
And,
yeah. They even turned off the internet and it didn't work.
It didn't work. In fact, they can't keep it off because it would completely destroy the economy. And even in North Korea, information is seeping in, but it's probably the only place in the world that really is trying to insulate the world from this kind of phenomena. And even there, it's not going to work. So it is a very democratizing technology, and information empowers people, and it's doing it everywhere in the world. And you see people in these developing nations, Libya, Egypt, where they're very sophisticated about the use of these technologies and these tools, and also the young people see how the rest of the world shares knowledge and information, and how they live, and how their societies are governed compared to other places, and they got very strong ideas of what they want, and it's a very democratizing technology, and also the tools of creativity are democratized. So a couple of kids at Stanford can, with a late night dorm challenge, created Google.
Right.
And a kid and his friends trying to get a better way to meet other people and for people to date. And,
you put that nicely, Ray.
Created Facebook.
That's a nice way to put it.
Well,
Ray, you
still
said
actually a major application of Facebook.
Maybe the single most important. In Fantastic Voyage, I think it was, that you said, I want to live long enough to live forever. Do you want to?
Yeah, that's actually the subtitle of Fantastic Voyage, Live Long Enough to Live Forever. As reference really to the idea of a bridge to a bridge to a bridge. So we don't have in our hands right now all the knowledge and tools to live indefinitely, which I think is a proper expression of the goal, because I can never come on your program and say, I've done it. I've succeeded. I've lived forever.
we won't be there for that. Maybe we will. I hope we can.
Well, you can't. You can't. You got to stop living to be sure that you lived forever, which means you haven't lived forever. So it's a bit of a conundrum.
It's never forever, but we'll get to a point where we can back ourselves up, and even that. I mean, I've written philosophically about that. Even if you back up a process, that doesn't mean it's going to live forever. I mean, try restoring now some word processing file you wrote in WordStar.
Right.
And good luck. Unless you maintain information, it doesn't live, and there's actually an important philosophical point there. But we will get. So we talk about a bridge to a bridge to a bridge. Bridge one is what you can do right now. That's actually a long discussion, but there's a lot you can do to slow down aging and disease processes, and people realize. And most of these books are actually about that. But bridge two is the full flowering of this biotechnology revolution, which I've alluded to already, because health and medicine was not an information technology. It was just hit or miss up until very recently. But now the cutting edge of it is to really understand the software biology and reprogram it just the way, this is reprogramming itself now. It's updating itself while we speak. I'm literally walking around with software that was evolved tens of thousands of years ago, in some cases millions of years ago. And it's not a metaphor. It is literally software.
Your DNA.
Strings of data, 23,000 genes, and some of the old ideas about it were naive. One gene, one disease, one gene, one trait. But nonetheless, your genes do control your lives, and they then express themselves as information, and there's other levels of information processing with stem cells and so on. But we're learning how that information technology works. and we're also learning to modify it. RNA interference can turn genes off. New forms of gene therapy can add new genes. I'd like to tell my fat insulin receptor gene, you don't need to hold on to every calorie anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm confident I'll have food tomorrow. Next hunting season will be good.
Yeah, don't worry.
And that was actually tried in animal experiments, and these animals ate a lot and remained slim, and they got the benefits of being slim, and they lived 20% longer, and that's being worked on by the Joslin Diabetes Center with some pharmaceutical companies, and that's just one of the 23,000 genes we'd like to reprogram. And there's other aspects of this. It's a long discussion, but we're ultimately going to be able to master and perfect the very imperfect processes of biology. Because when we evolved, it was actually in the interest of the human species for people not to live past their 20s. Because by that time, you've brought up your kids and you're just using up the limited food and resources of the tribe.
Yeah, just long enough to keep the species going.
So life expectancy was 22 or something 1,000 years ago. It was 37 in 1800. The full flowering of the biotechnology revolution is only 15 and 20 years away. It's progressing exponentially, not linearly. A lot of people look at this and look at how long things took with the old paradigm of medicine and really fail to appreciate that despite the fact that medicine was linear up until recently, because it was not an information technology, it's now going to progress in this exponential manner. And the golden age of biotechnology, that's what we call the second bridge, is only 15, 20 years away. The third bridge is the full flowering of the nanotechnology revolution, where we can build blood cell-sized devices to keep us healthy from inside. That's at least a quintessential application. I used to call it the killer app, but that's not probably the right.
It's the reverse
description for a health technology. But if it sounds very futuristic to put millions of little nanobots in your bloodstream, there are precursors of this. There's dozens of animal experiments of putting blood cell-sized devices in the bloodstream. One scientist cured type 1 diabetes in rats with a blood cell-sized device with 7 nanometer pores, lets insulin out in a controlled fashion, blocks antibodies. So these are early experiments, but the golden age of that is 20, 25 years away. That will bring us to a point where we actually can access who we are and capture the information. It's not a metaphor. It's also not a metaphor to say that there's information in my brain that represents my memories, my skills, my personality, and that is not backed up. And that might sound ridiculous, but we would think it irresponsible not to back up the information you have on your computers, yet we walk around without backing up our mind files. So
now I'm scared. Oh, boy, you're right.
Brain crash.
Yeah. Will you pour your brain?
Some of your brain is backed up. If you lose the portion that Parkinson's disease destroys, at least in the first 10 or 12 years, there's an implant actually put in the body and then connected into the brain, and it replaces the functionality of those neurons. It's an early, fairly simple example, but and it's not person specific, it's sort of species specific. But ultimately, we will get to a point where we can capture this very person-specific information that defines who you are and back it up. Now, if you were to just take that and create another person in another substrate or an avatar in virtual reality, you can make a strong philosophical argument that that's not me. But I think the real process is going to be one where we maintain the continuity of identity. And we're going to be introducing more and more non-biological intelligence. Once that's inside our brains, talk to a human person, it'll be a hybrid, a cyborg, combination of biological and non-biological intelligence. The non-biological part, just like computers today, will also be out in the cloud. And so our thinking will be not only just inside our brains and not just in the biological and non-biological portion, but also out in the cloud. We'll have direct brain-to-brain communication. We'll be able to inhabit very realistic virtual reality environments, incorporating all the senses. There's many other scenarios, but we're going to basically expand who we are and back up all that information. That'll happen automatically because anything that's non-biological is backed up today.
When we get to that point, do we not lose, but do we change the meaning of identity. And I'm thinking about, in an infinitely copyable internet, it is impossible to own a file because you make hundreds of copies of it in the course of using it. Do we run into that with our own identities? You know, once you've backed up your identity as a store of information, that means it's copyable and infinitely copyable. And so your identity could spread out and encompass all of these different versions of you.
I mean, you're alluding to a deep philosophical question which has been debated.
You don't have the answer?
Well, I haven't finished my answer yet.
Okay.
It's been debated, actually going back to the Platonic dialogues, where they, imagined a scenario really not that different from this. And Leibniz in the 19th century imagined that the brain actually was made up of little mechanisms. He didn't know about electronics, so he talked about mechanical mechanisms, but actually they were computing mechanisms. And then he imagined where's identity and where's consciousness, and we accept this very routinely. We give an identity to a copyable software entity. We can, in fact, have avatars that have a personality, and they're not at human levels yet, although some are getting actually fairly close, on the Loebner Turing test. And or take Watson. I mean, it's a software entity, runs on certain hardware, but it has a certain personality. And we accept the fact that it's copyable. And we find that perplexing because we're so married to this idea of the software of our existence and our identity being married to one hardware substrate. And when that hardware crashes, the software disappears with it. And people imagine, in the scenarios I talk about, a loss of something essential, but there's no loss. There's only actually a transcendence of limitations we've had. We still have a body. We'll still be able to love. In fact, we'll be much freer to love than we did before. We'll still have personalities. I don't believe consciousness or identity is substrate dependent. There are people walking around with computers in their bodies and connected into their brains already, and we don't consider them less human. And I've actually talked to them, and they consider those computers to be part of themselves, by and large. Because you ask different people, you get different answers. But I think we're going to get there gradually, and we'll get used to it. Things that seem startling even today, once they happen, it's amazing how quickly just people accept it. Oh, that's just everyday reality. I wrote about ebooks in the 1992 for a series of articles in the Library Journal, and people thought that was crazy. And maybe that'll happen 1,000 years from now. And now that it's happened, of course, not a big deal.
Yeah.
And generally, when technology is introduced, first they're introduced, they don't really work very well. People say, oh, well, it's not really such a big deal because it doesn't really work. And then gradually, works better and better. And by the time it works well, it's really inexpensive and ubiquitous. And then people say, well, it's not such a big deal. It's been around for a long time. And so these things may seem startling, but they're going to happen. They're going to creep up on us. We'll start putting technologies in our bodies and brains to keep us healthier, extend our memories, and it's going to happen bit by bit. I don't think technology is separate from human beings. I mean, we are human-machine civilization. We're the only species that transcends our limitations. In terms of biology, that started a long time ago. As I said, life expectancy was 1,000 years ago. So we will accept this. You can do a series of mental experiments with the kinds of questions you were alluding to and come out with reasonable answers. I mean, I discuss these issues in Chapter 7 of Singularity is Near. I have a new book, which I'm writing, called How the Mind Works and How to Build One. And I actually refer to it as the mind in the title, rather than the brain, because a mind is a brain that's conscious and has an identity.
Right.
But I don't believe that's a sort of a mystical addition. It's not. There's not a duality there. It's an emergent property of the complex hierarchical system that the human brain constitutes.
Ray, you've made so many accurate predictions in your life? Are there any things that you thought that would happen that have just that you realize no, that ain't going to happen?
Well, I actually did an analysis. I had 147 predictions in the age of spiritual machines for the year 2009. So it was a good idea to look at those. And then I also looked at the others that I've made over the last 25 years, including the ones in Age of Intelligent Machines, which I wrote in the 1980s. The Age of Spiritual Machines I wrote in the late 90s. It came out in 99. I wrote it in 97, 98. So it had these 147 predictions for 2009. Something like 86% were basically correct. So one that's wrong, which ironically people tell me how praise me on, is
Of course,
that we would have driverless cars, driven by AI, and in fact, they do exist.
yeah,
The
you
Google
were
car.
wrong. Yeah,
Well, it is wrong because I looked carefully at the wording and it implied it would be pretty commonly used, and it's not commonly used. It's still certainly very experimental. And the leaders of that field feel we're 10 years away from ubiquitous or common use, and that's beyond my threshold. If something was like a year off, I would call it essentially correct, but if it's 10 years off, it's like I rated it as wrong, although the technology is ahead of where most people have thought. The Google cars have logged 140,000 miles of driving in cities and towns without human drivers. There's a human in the car to take over, but they don't need to. We're actually, I think, already at a point where they can do a better job than humans, because that's not a very difficult threshold.
you said that once the universe is saturated with intelligence, it will wake up, and that's God. Do you stand by that? Is that a prediction?
I mean, I think,
Or is it Google?
Is Google God?
God, it's consistent with what I've said. God is a term which people refer to different concepts. So people ask, do you believe in God? And people say yes or no, but they're
Depends
not
what you mean, of
necessarily,
course. Yeah.
they're not necessarily talking about the same thing.
Right.
I like the definition where God is the ultimate in creativity, intelligence, beauty, love. Actually, these are all the things at the very highest level, conceptual level in our neocortex. And I do believe, those qualities exist in the world. And so if beauty and love and creativity is God, then I believe in those things. So I believe in God. And we will reach the highest expression of those when we've saturated the universe, turned it into what we call computronium, which is computation, infused with all of the software of the human-machine civilization, with all the fantastic knowledge, which we've managed to then multiply and double, every year, starting from now till, say, 100 years from now, or hundreds of years from now. That'll be just a vast amount of beauty and love and creativity and music and art and science. And so people imagine, gee, there's a certain amount to know, and once we know all that, what are we going to do? We're going to sit back and do nothing. Human knowledge has been growing and expanding exponentially too, and you can see it even in fields like music and art. When I was a kid, there was classical music and pop music, and today there's 100 different genres. And so, I mean, the amount of knowledge we're creating is vast. The more knowledge we create, the more we actually discover that we don't know. So our circle of ignorance also expands exponentially. We're always going to be on that frontier of knowledge. That is the job of the human civilization. In that regard, actually, we're carrying out the cutting edge of the job of evolution, because evolution created our species, and now we are now creating this explosion of knowledge. So I think that's about as godlike as we can hope to become.
So you're an optimist.
Well, I've been accused of that. And in some ways, I'm optimistic. I mean, you do have to have an optimistic personality to be an inventor and an entrepreneur.
You sure do, yeah.
optimism is not just an idle prediction about the future. It's actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you're more likely to have a positive outcome if you're optimistic than pessimistic. But I'm not a naive optimist, and I've actually written extensively about the downsides of these technologies. And technology is a double-edged sword. Fire cooked our meals and kept us warm thousands of years ago, but it was also, could be destructive accidentally or intentionally. And it's certainly true of today's tools. And we've seen plenty of that in the 20th century. 180 million people died in the wars of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And these new technologies are also very powerful. And around the time I was born, the human race, got used to an existential risk that had never existed before. We had a technology where we could destroy, in theory, and it wasn't so theoretical, because I remember these drills in school where we get under our desks and
duck and
put
cover.
our arms behind our head as if that was going to protect us from an atomic explosion.
We were optimists.
It's a
that's
placebo.
The definition of optimism.
So technology is a double-edged sword. I've written extensively about what the downsides are. In fact, a lot of the people who are very negative and considered pessimists, like Bill McKibben, is a friend of mine, and I respect him as an environmentalist, the first to write about global warming. Mm-hmm. But he wrote a book called Enough, basically translates as enough already. These new technologies have been great, but enough is enough.
We got enough technology.
And he's opposed to the continuation of GNR, genetics, nanotechnology, robotics, and AI. And he cites my books as, and quotes me extensively in terms of my descriptions of the downsides. Mm. And I think we agree on the downsides. We disagree on the prescription. I don't think relinquishment is the answer. The answer is actually to create defenses. I don't think relinquishment would work. It would just drive these technologies underground where they'd be more dangerous.
Right. Well, Europe tried it in the 1200s.
Yeah, it was called the Dark
before.
Ages.
Yeah, a lot of times it's referred to as the Dark Ages. You get rid of knowledge and technology. It didn't work out so well.
Exactly. And we still have we have a moral imperative to continue. There's very encouraging things happening with cancer. We're going to tell the cancer patients that, no, we're canceling all that because it's too dangerous. And it is dangerous. I mean, a bioterrorist could take those same tools and create a new bioweapon. The right answer to that is, of course, to have the right ethical standards for responsible scientists, which, we have the Asilomar guidelines in biotech. Those have actually worked quite well. And then to have a rapid response system where when people do try to be destructive, we can detect that quickly and counteract it. I've worked with the Army on that problem in terms of biological viruses. There are answers. We've done a good job in that regard, for example, with software viruses. We have a technological immune system. It'll never be perfect, but it actually does a pretty good job. So it's a complex issue. I'm not naive about these issues. I've written extensively about the dangers, and I've worked on addressing them. And I think the reason I communicate about these issues is we need to understand the positive side, that the major problems that we struggle with, availability of water and food and housing and poverty and disease, really the only thing that can address these major challenges, the only thing that will provide the scale to address them is the exponentially growing information technologies. On the other hand, there are new dangers, and we need to be aware of those and work on those also. And really, it's to share that perspective with people that I communicate about it.
Ray's website is Kurzweil AI, and the AI stands for acceleratingintelligence.net.
Kurzweil, KurzweilAI.net.
Yep.
And we have a newsletter, which is very widely read. It's free. You can sign up by just putting your email address on the homepage. And you can get a daily or a weekly version. It's actually remarkable with how many new things happen every day in these areas.
Well, and I do want to tell people that the movie Transcendent Man, which is the, kind of documentary about Ray's life and ideas, is traveling around the world. In fact, it's going to be in San Francisco next.
It'll be in San Francisco in April. If you go to transcendentman.com, there's information about that screening. It's it's a movie about me. It was made by Barry Ptolemy. Barry did a brilliant job, I think, of showing point and counterpoint and interweaving my life story. And it's a beautifully made movie.
You can buy it online too. It's on iTunes.
Right, it's on iTunes. It's been the second most popular documentary in the country.
Oh, that's neat.
It's on Movies on Demand. So I do recommend people see that. It's a good introduction to these ideas.
You were writing a book on the a movie on the singularities near. Did that come out?
Yeah, there's a movie that I made based on the singularities near, and that'll be out later this year.
Oh, good.
It's been traveling the festival circuit and won some awards. And
congratulations! I look forward to seeing that. Ray, it's been a pleasure talking to you as always, and I have all your books, and as you can see, they're well thumbed. So, sometimes it reads like science fiction, but it's so solidly backed up by fact. It's pretty exciting.
Oh, it was great to talk to you.
Yeah.
And
thanks for joining us.
Yeah. So we'll meet again in 100 years, but hopefully much sooner.
I hope so. I look forward to that. Maybe our substrates will be different, but we can continue on.
Substrate's not important.
Yeah. I got to take this substrate out of here. I got to get.
You can't judge a book by its substrate.
That's right. Thank you, Ray. Ray Kurzweil.
Thank you,
My
Ray.
pleasure.
Take care. KurzweilAI.net. And once again, this has been it's so fun to do this show because we get to meet so many really smart and interesting people. I didn't really begin the show with a list of Ray's accomplishments. There are so many, but maybe go see the movie would be a good idea. He's an inventor, as you heard, and a futurist, and has some brilliant ideas. And if you're going to pick one book, I guess the Age of Spiritual Machines and the Age of Intelligent Machines is great, but the Singularity is the one that I think makes the strongest case for what this future holds for us. It's fascinating.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
then for if you want to live long enough to live forever, the Fantastic Voyage is a great book. He did that with Terry Grossman, who's a physician. And that's it for this edition of our show. Once again, if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, you have a chance to see Transcendent Man. It's coming up on April, let's get this right, 14th at the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. And there's video online at transcendentman.com, but you can also get it on iTunes and elsewhere. And I feel bad because, but I didn't want to kind of go through the litany, but I mean, he created the synthesizer. First, he created the text-to-speech engine that Stevie Wonder used, and then he made a synthesizer. He got to know Stevie, made this amazing Kurzweil synthesizer. He's just done so many interesting things.
We'll have to have him back and say, okay, we talked about the deep stuff.
Let's talk about
Stevie.
Talk about Stevie. He was let's see. When he was a teenager, he created a pattern recognition program that analyzed the works of classical composers. This is in high school, and then synthesized its own song in the same style.
And went on TV, which back then was a huge deal.
He was on I've Got a Secret.
He had 3 channels.
I wonder if I bet you it's in the movie.
I'm sure there's at least a clip or 2 of it.
Yeah, it'd be fun to see Ray Kurzweil as a teenager on I've Got a Secret.
Yeah.
Showing off his synthesizer. So really a brilliant guy. And, there are a lot of people talked about his ideas in a lot of different ways. Yeah, here it is. Look at this. I found it. But I think it's food for thought, and certainly something that we need to think about as we approach this time where the machines are, no doubt about it, getting smarter. This is Ray Kurzweil on I've Got a Secret. This goes back a few years. 1965.
First of all, would you tell the folks your name and the size of the curtain that's moving in? Oh, I'm sorry. Your name, please.
My name is Raymond Kurzweil, and I'm from Queens, New York.
Queens, New York. Well, panel, Raymond and I just happened to have brought along this little piano here, as you see.
17.
And Raymond, in addition, also happens to have, as the old saying goes, happens to have a piece of music with him. And before we show the audience what his secret is, we have just a few seconds for Raymond to play this piece of music. Raymond, the piano's all yours.
Thank you.
This is going to completely mislead them because it's not.
nicely played, and now your performance, of course, leads into your secret, so if you'll whisper it to me, we'll let everybody
Steve
at home
Allen.
know what's up.
Ryan Seacrest of his
I
day.
designed and built an electronic computer. Wow.
That certainly deserves applause, but throw the subway.
Well, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. I'm sure we'll have another great guest on Triangulation. Bye-bye.